Blue Eye Samurai might be one of the greatest animated shows ever made. When I first heard that Blue Eye Samurai was a show, I genuinely thought it was a joke. As much as we have made strides in modern storytelling, the notion of a mixed-race animated protagonist during Edo period Japan was almost too good to be true. As a mixed person myself, it's the kind of thing that I always wanted to see, but I never thought we'd actually get it. This show is worthy of every considerable award it's earned for its stunning animation and editing, inspired action sequences, and incredibly nuanced writing, delivered by husband-wife writing team Michael Green and Amber Noizumi. Director of the series, Jane Wu, described the inspiration for the show's look to be similar to that of a moving painting, and holy hell did they nail it. I'm not usually a huge fan of the modern 3D animation trying to look 2D style, but this show is gorgeous. The wide open landscape shots, the vibrant use of color, the fast-paced action, the lighting and framing of every shot has so much thought and detail put into it, both artistically and historically, and the amount of research that went into making this show is nuts. The production team consulted experts in architecture, Edo period food, clothing, linguistics. There are a ton of details that they put in that they don't even call attention to, and they're just there for period accuracy. Like the nightingale floors in the Tokunobu house, or the narrative use of the Bunraku puppet theater, or how they match the English language spoken by different characters to the different levels of Japanese formality. They did so much to make the show feel as grounded to the time period as possible. All this work builds a genuinely beautiful and complex story about a character who does not belong to the time that she inhabits. Mizu, the titular Blue Eye Samurai, does not fit into any standard class, gender, trade, or ethnicity. The subject of binaries is constantly called into question over the course of Mizu's story. Man or woman? White or Japanese, warrior or demon. Mizu fails to conform to the rigid binaries of society, and because of this, she falls into the cracks of marginalization. And she's not alone. Ringo, Taigen, and Akame all fail to conform in their own ways, all of them existing in the liminal space between one thing and another. Blue Eye Samurai describes the experience of marginalization in the context of race, class, gender, and disability through the liminal lives of its main cast, and busts the door wide open to the larger conversation about what it means to actually exist as a non-person in society. So strap on your sword, adjust your shades, and join us as we take a look at the binaries of Blue Eye Samurai. I was a little anxious about watching Blue Eye Samurai initially, as historically, popular stories of mixed race characters have been not awesome. Although there have been some really good recent ones. I'll link them in the description. But the raccoon, whom I trust implicitly, assured me that it had everything I like. She was right. The story of Blue Eye Samurai takes place in 1600s Japan during the Edo period, when the shogun completely closed Japan's borders, cutting the country off from the outside world. This was right after the Sengoku period, otherwise known as the Warring States period, where for about 100 years, Japan was plagued by civil wars, assassination, and political upheaval. After the Tokugawa clan took power, they closed the borders, redistributed the land to loyal families, and had every daimyo swear fealty to the shogunate's rule. This is a very interesting time period to set a story like Blue Eye Samurai's. It's a period of time where people of mixed race were viewed as less than human. Foreigners and their families were forced to flee Japan. Quite notably, we have very few written records of people of mixed heritage living in Japan at this time. A prime example is William Adams, a 17th century English navigator who became allies with the Tokugawa shogun and decided to stay in Japan after its borders closed. He married a Japanese woman and they had 2 children together named Joseph and Susanna. But after Adams' death in 1620, there are few records of what happened to his children. Apparently a record exists showing that Joseph Adams was still alive in 1635, but that's it. There's not much else. Mizu is not just mixed race, but she's also a woman. Gender inequality is a major focus of Blue Eye Samurai. At a time in Japanese history where women had almost no legal rights, in order to better defend an illegal existence and active pursuit, Mizu lives her life dressed as a man. As a child, pretending to be a boy was relatively simple, but as she grew older, she had to start actually physically hiding her femininity in ways to appear more masculine, binding her chest in wraps, speaking in a lower register, and wearing clothes that better obscure her form. The context for the show's creation informed a lot of what it ended up becoming. Co-writer Michael Green has a lot of projects under his belt, including all of the latest Agatha Christie murder mystery movies, as well as Blade Runner 2049 and Logan. But his wife and co-writer Amber Noizumi has said that she got the idea for the story when their daughter was born about 15 years ago with blue eyes, which inspired her to think about her own internalized racism, being a woman of mixed race herself. She and her husband have apparently been workshopping this idea ever since. It's so interesting that they chose to tell a story set in a world of strict rules where the main character cannot conform to the binaries of her society, even if she wanted to.
You're soft for a boy. Mixed breeds are all weak stock.
Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to spend a little time defining terms and giving a little preface. Fiction is always about the present, even when it's couched in terms of science fiction, fantasy, history, etc. That said, when it comes to historical settings, especially stories where the historical setting is so carefully and deliberately realized, it's important to remember that these binaries are bound to a historical context and are being reinterpreted by modern viewers, writers with modern sensibilities. That being said, what is a binary? A binary is the concept that something exists having only two parts. It is a system that categorizes subjects into two things, one or the other, with no accounting for anything in between. They are also often arbitrary and exist as social conveniences. A good example of a binary that existed historically in the United States is the loathsome one-drop rule that afforded legal definitions of blackness during the early 20th century. It goes by a few different names historically, the one black ancestor rule being another common one. Conceptually, the one-drop rule stated that a person with a single African American ancestor in their bloodline was to be considered legally black. If you had a single drop of African American blood in you, you were legally black. It's known as hypodescent, the concept that any racially mixed person was designated to the group with the lower racial or socioeconomic status. To quote the infamous race scientist and eugenicist Madison Grant's, the passing of the great race... Oh, I can't do it. One of you guys, please help me.
The cross between a white man and an Indian is an Indian. The cross between a white man and a Negro is a Negro. The cross between a white man and a Hindu is a Hindu. And the cross between any of the three European races and a Jew is a Jew.
This is obviously absolute disgusting nonsense. The legal state of blackness was a convenient way for white slave owners to keep their power. But as convenient as the categories like black and white are, they're ludicrous in the consequence of the heinous inevitabilities of chattel slavery, a system that incentivizes slave owners to commit atrocity that so often results in mixed-race children. So rules were created to enforce the binary that conveniences those in power. Another example, the gender binary, is the concept that there are only two genders and one's gender assigned at birth corresponds to one of the two acceptable sexes and will align with the traditional social constructs of masculine and feminine. This concept is an odd mix of outdated and simple as well as historically nonsensical, as more than two genders have been observed in many cultures across the globe, and contrary to scientific observation throughout the ages. Observable human and animal behavior and genuine observable science indicates that sexuality and expression in nature is a spectrum, not a binary. The same goes for gender. That being said, modern and historical binaries have massive impacts on society at large. Like any construct attributed power, it becomes real enough to enforce and makes a lot of people's lives an impossible misery. Conforming to social norms for a significant number of people is impossible because they belong to the target demographics that the binaries seek to eliminate. The suffering and elimination from society is part of the design and has become enshrined in our real-life system. Politics, laws, religion, and tradition are all things that people historically feel like they should be proud of, so much so that they often become woven into the fabric of society without realizing it. However, binaries as symbols in a work of fiction are often used to incredible effect to show the struggle of everyone living within that system. In Blue Eye Samurai, these binaries are constantly brought up by the characters, either through dialogue or metaphor. Water and steel are both used frequently to show Mizu's internal struggle, but the binaries extend to almost every primary cast member. Man, woman, owner, property, noble, peasant, able, disabled, pure, unclean, war, peace, spiritual, non-spiritual, holy or demonic, Japanese or white. The show ultimately concludes that binaries are false. No primary character in Blue Eye Samurai is a pure embodiment of any one thing. The world has been divided into these strict and arbitrary binaries that are poised to rule the lives of everyone, except for when they can't. While the setting of Blue Eye Samurai is established around a tight, structured society, the story focuses on those pushed to the fringes of that society, the ones who don't conform, the ones who the rules don't apply to, the marginalized.
You are still a dog.
Marginalized communities are groups of people that experience discrimination due to not being members of the dominant social, political, or economic majority. These forms of discrimination can be based on gender, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, disability, financial circumstances, and a myriad of other reasons. They are also intersectional. There's a misconception that marginalization just represents the people who are a part of an ethnic or gender minority, but it expands to include anyone who isn't a member of the social majority. For example, the homeless population are a huge minority in North America who go through multiple forms of discrimination. Not only with the way that we as a society are taught to view people who are homeless as lesser people, but also in the way that our cities are built, utilizing hostile architecture to prevent the homeless from gathering or sleeping in common spaces. A great example of marginalized characters from mainstream media are the protagonists from Princess Mononoke. Ashitaka and San both exist as marginalized individuals who do not fit into either of their respective societies. They belong to neither of the binary factions that represent the society in the world of their story. Ashitaka is the prince of a human village, but is afflicted with a demonic curse and is exiled as part of his own people's laws. He travels the world as an outsider amongst humans, viewed with suspicion and intrigue. The Amishi people are all supposed to be dead, wiped out by the Japanese emperor generations ago, so Ashitaka already exists on the fringe of history at best and myth at worst. He doesn't belong with normal human society, even if he wasn't cursed. Ashitaka's marginalization is twofold. San, on the other hand, was abandoned as a baby and raised by wolves. She is the daughter of Moro, the wolf goddess, and a child of the wilderness. She fights for the spirit of the forest and harbors a deep hatred for humanity for the destruction they've brought upon the environment. But no matter what she says or does, San is still treated like an outsider to the other creatures of the forest. They won't ever truly accept her because, whether she likes it or not, she's still human. Both characters exist in the margins between humanity and nature. They are both, and they are neither. And it's because of this that they're able to bridge the gap between both worlds. It's their perspectives as less, both, and more that enable them to make peace between factions. Blue Eye Samurai focuses on the marginalized specifically. All of the main characters making big changes are outcasts or have been disowned by society. They exist in the margins because the ruling class don't know that they exist, and in so many ways cannot know they exist. Mizu has no official documents or travel permits, and she can't get them because of who and what she is. Mizu lives in the margins of society. Despite being competent, strong, and skilled, Mizu's existence is a crime. Like how sexual identity can be a crime, or how immigrants existing in a foreign country without the right papers is a crime. She's been hunted her entire life simply because of what she is. Who she is completely irrelevant. It's quite notable that all of the main cast of Blue Eye Samurai are marginalized people. Individuals who have been disowned, outcast, outlawed, or viewed as less than by society at large. So let's take a minute to discuss the binaries that bind the major cast and how they exist within them. Ringo is a congenitally disabled person. He was born without hands and he struggled all his life to pursue and perfect his trade. Ringo is a noodle maker and a pretty good one at that, addressed by one of the customers at his father's shop who complains about the food's quality after Ringo leaves.
You're better at cleaning than cooking. When does your son get back?
He even wields a knife forged by a master craftsman. If you paid attention during the show, you can see Mizu's signature engraved on the blade. Ringo is very skilled at what he does, and yet he's viewed as a burden. His father abuses him and treats him as less than simply because he's disabled. But Ringo is hardly a burden. He proves himself capable right after he follows Mizu into the world, helping her through the border with his travel pass, showing that he's knowledgeable about trade and people. He proves his worth over and over again, cooking Mizu's food, brewing medicine, mending her wounds, and defending himself in battle. He constantly proves his worth and value that he is capable. But because of his lack of hands, he's still looked down on by others. Even when acknowledged by people like Taigen, he still speaks about him in this demeaning tone.
I'll tell you what, after I kill him, you come work for me. You can't be my apprentice. I mean, look at you, half-limbed to a half-wit. But I'll certainly make a place for you in my kitchens.
Class-wise? These two are equals, but because Taigen has hands and can wield a sword, he thinks Ringo's beneath him. However, it is important to note that Ringo does not see himself as less than or less capable than other people because he doesn't have hands. He's created his own aids and lives, by all means, a relatively normal life, or would if people didn't treat him badly because of a disability.
Noodles is not war.
My whole life has been a battle.
He has not internalized how people see him. Taigen is a skilled warrior. He was lowborn, but became the strongest samurai at the Shindo dojo, set to marry Lady Akame and became the captain of the guard for the Tokunobu house. But after he's defeated by Mizu in a duel, Taigen's dojo disowns him. He did nothing wrong. In fact, he fought better than any of his fellows. Mizu carved through them all, trainee and master alike. But Taigen was their golden boy. He represented Shindo Dojo's honor. His failure is their failure, so they disowned him in order to keep the dojo's honor and save face. Notably, they also lose nothing by throwing him away like trash. Because after all, he has no clan to speak for the insult. For all that he was their star student, he's ultimately completely disposable. Taigen's ascension to samurai is really remarkable for a time like this, considering how rigid class structure was during the Edo period. Taigen is a commoner. He was born a poor fisherman's son who managed to work his way to notoriety through his exceptional skill as a swordsman and rub elbows with the ruling elite. This makes his disowning that much harder. And the fact that he was defeated by a person of mixed race, a person viewed as shameful and subhuman, what does that make him? He's no longer exceptional because of his poor status. It makes him disposable. He's lost all status in their society. However, like Ringo, how the world sees him doesn't actually define how he sees himself.
84,000 Dharmadors. For me, there were only two. The net or the sword.
He's climbed to nobility because he wanted more and chased it, believing himself worthy of attaining it to begin with. By the end of the season, I think it's interesting to note that Taigen has gained a lot of wisdom and self-reflection about who he is and what he wants, but most importantly, he's proven his nobility to himself.
I don't need to be great. I just want to be happy.
By acting honorably and honestly and cleaving to those ideals at an immense personal cost. Akame is the noble-born daughter of the Tokunobu clan in Kyoto. She's born with status. However, Akame finds herself caught in the margins of her own social crisis in the form of her personal freedom. She wants the independence to make her own decisions, but during this time period, women had almost no say in who they married. In fact, women had no say in essentially any aspect of their lives, and were even expected to speak in a childishly humble manner to soothe the egos of their male masters if they wanted to obtain anything they needed. Akame's virginity is another thing that gets brought up during these interactions with the other noble houses, a quality of hers that people hold in high regard, but she's not a virgin. She slept with Taigen probably multiple times. During the story, she goes off to search for him and ends up traveling to various brothels in search of him and Mizu in the guise of a prostitute. Through this, she experiences, briefly, that life. She's caught between the two roles that women are allowed in society.
This is the world. It grants women a fixed number of paths: proper wife or improper whore.
Prostitutes and prostitution in general have always existed on the margins of society, and as much as Akame chafes against the rules that are, Akame does not see herself as diminished by her improper exploits, and does not or has ever attached her values to what others attach it to. The difference between proper wife and improper whore, even when spat out by her father, are illusions constructed by the people who would contain her regardless. She is both, she is neither, and she's determined to be great regardless.
I want to be great.
Seiki is quite an interesting character in the story of Blue Eyes Samurai. He is a marginalized person, not so much in the ways of being outcast or disabled, but in his role as Akame's attendant. Seiki is a senior attendant in the Tokunobu household, but more specifically, he fulfills the role of maid and advisor to Akame, a role that was typically assigned to women. Seiki calls himself a poor swordsman, but he managed to gain favor with Akame's father, to the point of being his senior advisor. Throughout the show, though, Seiki spends the majority of his time attending to Lady Akame, tutoring her, advising her, and accompanying her on her journey. This is extremely uncommon and quite intriguing. When confronting Akame about her marriage to the shogun's son, this interesting interaction occurs.
They say he's a tyrant.
What man isn't?
You.
Seiki is kind and fulfills roles as both caretaker and protector, both mother and father, samurai and attendant. They are all both, and they are all neither. Master Eiji is a master swords craftsman. He is a skilled blacksmith, but like a monk, he lives out in the woods where no one has to see him. Being blind, a disability, was a trait in Japan that would have prevented Eiji from being accepted by society. He lives his life in solitude because being blind is seen as a shameful thing. That being said, Eiji's skill as a swordsmith does allow him to be part of society as an archetype, a socially accepted mystical character known as the Blind Sage, who is revered for having wisdom and knowledge. The archetype affords him a valued position in society and income. And also, people really do just need blacksmiths, who do quite a bit more than make swords most of the time. Swordsmiths are a different breed. Master Eiji's blindness, being viewed as a shameful thing, also affords him the wisdom and opportunity to overlook other people's less desirable qualities, things that would also be deemed shameful. Mizu's mixed heritage, Ringo's lack of hands, these are not good or bad qualities for them to have, they're just qualities.
You may be something shameful. You may also be strong.
Someone in his position knows better than to judge someone for their appearance or disability. Mizu takes a lot of Master Eiji's teaching to heart, and he becomes a father figure to her throughout her childhood. That being said, Eiji is also a fallible human being in addition to this mystic sage. He is the product of his time and place. He has sagely advice and lives ascetically, but he's also not immune to the prejudices of his time and will not hear anything about Mizu's sex when she tries to come clean to him about it.
There's something more I must confess.
You've spoken enough nonsense today.
We cannot part in a lie.
That is your burden to keep.
I have made your swords unclean.
Quiet!
Eiji might see himself as above and separate from a lot of the things that plague the rest of society as a monk, but he's still subject to and capable of overlooking critical details in himself and in others until Mizu herself points them out to him.
If you must do this, take a sword.
I already have one.
Abijah Fowler is the antagonist for the entire first season of the show, an Irish merchant and a smuggler who gets rich off the shogun's business while keeping out of sight on his private island. Fowler represents the outside world that has been shut out, the world beyond Japan's borders. He is in every way a foreign body. Every part of him represents something that should not be in this place, like a bullet lodged in someone's ribs, a damaging invader that leaves ruin in its wake on the way out, the personification of conquest, and the word that will get us demonetized. There is a persistent narrative that pain makes someone stronger or kinder, but it's not universally true at all. The pain and misery that Fowler experienced turned him into the monster he is today.
My country's history is one of manufactured suffering. I was a boy when the Tudors burned any food the rebels under O'Neill might think to eat. We starved. Everyone starved.
I love the detail that Abijah Fowler was a child during the 9 Years' War in Ireland. It's such a good motivation for him wanting to control others. He is the product of colonialism and has from there become its peddler. In his world, there is only the victim and the conqueror. In Fowler's world, if you can only be one of the two, then why wouldn't you become the conqueror?
It was the last thing I ever did because I had to. I control my life now. Every bite.
The British Empire created this. Colonialism and empire are bound up in the shogun as well and the other rulers of Japan. They all aided and abetted Fowler because his trade worked in their favor, and then they lost control of him. As for how Fowler sees himself, he simply sees himself as a man and a winner, and in doing so tends to assume that others would be as horrifically violent as he is given half the chance, thus seeing himself as a perfectly normal individual within the rules of the society that he has lived through, a society that for Fowler is basically run by violent animals. Kill or be killed, be the conqueror or be the victim. So now that we've spent some time showing examples of some of the binaries that form the structural language of this story, it's time to talk about the title character herself and what makes her and her binaries distinct from the entire rest of the cast.
A monster. A creature of shame.
We're going to start with the elephant in the room and the show's first big reveal. This is actually something that annoys me. When the show first came out, I saw a bunch of video essays talking about Blue Eye Samurai being woke done right or fixing the strong female protagonist problem. And it's so fucking sad because the show is so much more than this clickbaity bullshit. It's reductive and contradictory to the thesis being presented. Mizu is not a strong female protagonist, TM, and there's a lot of arguments for why. In fact, while a huge emphasis on this show is on conflicts of gender, particularly the barbaric lot of women, Mizu, as with everything else about her, exists between the binary of man and woman. I hesitated initially to refer to Mizu exclusively with feminine pronouns because Mizu spent her entire life living masculine by necessity, despite being assigned female at birth. This plays a role in how she sees herself, but the more I agonized about it, the more I remember that historical queerness and how queer people identify and are described is something that also changes a lot through the ages. Way more specialized and expert essayists on these topics like Kaz Rowe go into incredible scholarly detail, but what matters is we're here, and the minutia of how Mizu identifies or which modern identity Mizu would theoretically subscribe to is largely speculative and up to viewer interpretation. What's important for the context of this essay is that Mizu is inarguably queer and exists between man and woman, and a big part of her struggle is her performance of gender, keeping in mind that gender as a concept is performative. She performs masculinity in order to survive. Masculinity being discipline, action, lonely strength, relying on no one. But her perceived ugliness and softness reflects that while she passes for masculine, there is a tension in scenes where it's called into question.
You need me because you're weak. Still a malnourished urchin on the street.
When it's convenient for others, however, she does make an honest attempt at living as a woman. She does her damnedest to perform womanhood as it's described, which is softness and beauty and pliability, submission. Oh. As you can see, when called upon to combine those two elements in the context of a classic heterosexual marriage, to be fully herself, exercising elements of masculinity and femininity, this is received as a wrongness. For her to be a woman, she has to perform in a lesser capacity to save the ego of her husband. Failure to perform woman well enough, proving herself too much and too manly, is punishable by fucking death. A miserable failure to be either results in more or less a gender identity that to me suggests she doesn't care about stuff like pronouns. Considering her own humanity from an I want perspective is just something she hasn't really made time for. Who cares if she's a man or a woman? She has, at this time, no interest in living a human life. And yet, there's a scene in Madame Kaji's brothel where Mizu is being taught about how denying desire is denying a part of one's soul. She sees a lot of naked ladies, but it's only when she sees two men kissing that she thinks back to that intense moment with Taigen. While I think that if asked, are you a man or a woman? Mizu would probably respond with something along the lines of, I'm an onryo. The takeaway here is that Mizu's experience of gender marginalization here touches on the worst of both worlds. The rest of the cast observe the labels the world proffers them, and while holding them at arm's length, don't define themselves as these things, even when working from much earthier worldviews. Ringo doesn't see himself as defective, Taigen doesn't see himself as lacking nobility as a characteristic, and Akame doesn't see herself as less of anything. They are frustrated by the stories the world offers them and actively resist them because they're not consistent with who they know themselves to be, regardless of where they're at in their character development cycle. Mizu has internalized the stories offered to her wholeheartedly and religiously. For Mizu, the story is and has always been that her mixed heritage is of an evil so perfect it's demonic. To be mixed is an impurity synonymous with evil itself. And in her own words,
I am made of mixed metal. No amount of hammering can remove my impurity.
She embraces terms like onryo to a part of herself that she can and never will be able to change. Despite a genuine devotion to her spirituality, her idea of grounding and coming to her center is the murder of the part of herself she sees as evil, in separating that part of herself into something that can be killed. She is not and never will be properly Japanese. She is not white, merely the other, half of two things, and a monstrous mix of both. The one story she does reject is the idea that she is a dog.
You're still a dog.
So she's not an animal, not a human, not a woman, not a man, not quite alive, but certainly not dead. The Onryo captures the idea of her as a sort of living haunting. Additionally, while it is very likely Mizu is the product of assault, I think it's telling that this is the only version of the story that Mizu considers as a possibility. Without knowing more, it's easy to say that, yeah, almost certainly. But there is a version of the story where Mizu's mother and father were together willingly. I wonder if that would change how Mizu sees herself. But that's not a part of her story as she tells it to herself, or how the living people with even the vaguest memories of what happened can offer her. For Mizu, the world is inflexible and disappointing. She has taken on many shapes to survive it. But as for who she is, goddamn, this person hates herself.
You think revenge is an art?
Swords, pots, noodles, death. It is all the same to an artist.
Then I am a bad artist.
She makes of her body a vessel for vengeance. But is she avenging her mother? Japan? Herself? When zoomed out, Mizu's revenge is a battle between the demonic and the holy, and initially it seems validated in the pure evil that Fowler shows us. Maybe he is her actual father, maybe he's not. It doesn't actually matter. The binary of race that Mizu labors against spiritually is the one she's actively holding on to. She can't allow herself to be happy, only satisfied.
I have no interest in money or power. I have no interest in being happy, only satisfied.
Because to be happy is to be human. And in the binary she's accepted, she is a demon. In the end, one drop is all it takes to be mixed metal in her eyes.
Nothing is born. Nothing broken.
The title of the story is an amazing one. The phrase is very catchy, very evocative of the stylish shows this one echoes. But very often when a show has a character with a samurai title, they're not actually a samurai. It's a guy with a sword and a code. Mizu is not a samurai, but she is a guy with the code, informed by the curse of blue eyes that will forever mark her as not Japanese in the eyes of the populace, no matter what she could ever hope to do. Her code is 100% informed by the blue eyes, representing her perceived curse, a white heritage, and herself, a body possessed by the spirit of vengeance acting as a demon in service to it. While every mixed-race person deals with this part of their identity differently, there is a song from Rebecca Lane, a Guatemalan artist, that I feel captures a part of that experience in 4 words. Mestiza soy, contradicción atroz, which literally means I am mixed, an atrocious contradiction, with an emphasis on the connotation of atrocity. A contradiction, an atrocity. Both words that are used to describe crimes and the unholy. The same goes for Mizu's gender. She's born a girl, but in order to survive with any modicum of freedom, she exists as a man. Who she is to herself is intensely private, and seems to exist between the idea of man and woman, Japanese and white. The world of Blue Eye Samurai, which is a fantastical representation of the historic, is one made up of arbitrary binaries. Binaries serve a fundamental purpose: to define, to give something a name, and rules means to control it. One can define and divide a population in order to achieve better mastery over their lives and their stories. But this can also apply to how stories use binaries like box cutters to slash up the interior life of individuals, dividing and conquering our very souls. This story so far is showing this through its massive cast in terms of their rejection or wholehearted internalization of this idea in the form of our protagonist, Mizu. However, I think it's important to consider this. Mizu's name simply means water, and I find it fascinating as a choice for a character that is driven by this raging, fiery revenge. Water is also considered to be a very feminine, yin-heavy element, passive, cool, and most importantly, able to take on the shape of the container as a virtue. The story of Blue Eye Samurai begins in frozen winter, when water is still, brittle, icy, breakable, and ends in roaring flame. As her character arc progresses, I expect to see the water in her go from frozen to boiling steam to potentially, assuming a triumphant ending, serene water, at peace with itself. I can't think of an element that is less static or more impossible to control. Our hero has made progress by season's end, but this story can't actually conclude until she's able to see herself as fully human. She's achieved catharsis by season 1's end, but not synthesis. The environment that changes and shapes water, however, brings us back to these binaries. These containers that threaten to define the essence of what someone is within the context of that specific container. And to do that, maybe a trip to London will be required to see the world beyond as one made up of a million imperfect individuals also rattling around in their binaries. I for one look forward to see how Mizu's world and the world of Blue Eye Samurai expands. Thanks to all of you who joined us for the premiere today, and a million thanks to all of our loyal viewers. This one was a major labor of love as the Hedgehog and I are both mixed, and these topics are incredibly close to the chest for us. Let us know in the comments what you think about how gender, race, class, and disability are presented in Blue Eye Samurai, and if you think that Fowler is actually Mizu's dad or not. Special shout out to Barbie for helping on the translation of the Spanish parts of this essay, as mine is not what it used to be. We'll see you all in the next one. This is the Bat signing off. Whee!